Good morning, everyone, and it's great pleasure to have you again on the Real Education Live program. Today, we are going to discuss the very core purpose of our human development. When we talk about education, sometimes we think of schooling, and it's an ongoing question worldwide that what is real education? I think that was the intention behind the way we started this project called RealEducation.com. In the same series, what we are doing, we are inviting thought leaders around the world to share their views on education so that as an individual, we can see that what should be the kind of education that we should get into and what should be the focus of education. In the same line, it is our pleasure that today we have Mr. R. Graham Oliver with us, who is having more than 50 years of experience in education. He has worked to develop a clear and ethical purpose of education and show that it would require. He holds that a lack of respect for learners lies at the heart of our significant educational struggles, frustration, and disappointment. So with that thought, I would like to invite Mr. R. Graham Oliver to share his views on purpose of education. Welcome to the show, sir.
Well, thank you very much. Oh, okay. From my point of view, there are two fundamental problems underlying our whole implementation of the idea of education in our day. The first is that we've condensed our picture of education down to a single institution, universal state compulsory schooling. This isn't traditional. I mean, in times before massive schooling, it was widely understood and just appreciated that it took a lot of institutions to educate somebody. So we've reduced it right down to this one institution, and all our talk about education is about that institution. And the second thing is that we've collapsed the idea of education itself into schooling. So the two now are synonyms. Education is schooling. Schooling is education. We've lost any sense of the difference. They're synonyms. So an educator is somebody who works in schools. And an education system is a schooling system. Now, this is a really serious problem because the difference between the two, between education and schooling, is a difference between ends and means. Schooling is just a means. It's a bundle of technologies to work with learning. And it can be used for a huge range of purposes, many of which are not good for people. They can be indoctrinatory in all kinds of ways, so that it's much larger in terms of the uses to which it can be put than education is. And at the same time, education has requirements that schools can never adequately meet. As a means, it isn't a complete means. It never could be a complete means in the best of circumstances for education itself. Now, we have every regime, every country in the world has an education system, regardless of whether it's a dictatorship or a totalitarian state, how it treats its people, whether it advantages some and disadvantages others. All of them are called education systems. So the meaning of education itself has been lost there. And I take it that the traditional large-scale purpose that every society has to resolve, that is educational, is how to bring people up, how to bring them up to live a good life in a good society. Now, every society considers itself to be the good one, and everyone traditionally has supposed that it knew what the good life was. In our time, that isn't so straightforward because we have to deal with huge diversity. We can't settle any longer on one conception of the good life and just teach people to grow up to be it. We've got to bring people up so that they can take charge of that themselves, and we expect everybody to take responsibility for themselves and what makes their lives worthwhile and fulfilling and meaningful. And at the same time, in order to do that, and this is partly globalization, it's partly technology, that we're all working together with all of our differences under common infrastructures, common kinds of economies, all these trade, all these kinds of things that we live under together with this sort of massive kind of difference. So we have to do it that way, bringing people up to take responsibility for themselves. And the only way in which we can organize societies when we talk about it is democratically, which means that it depends on consent. Now, these things create huge demands on growing up that formerly weren't there. Huge problems for what education would have to be and have to be like. And schooling is not about this at all. If I can just sort of go back my own potted version of the history of how this happens, universal compulsory state schooling systems have always arisen in empires with colonial ambitions. The first state schooling system was in imperial China, and it was there to produce administrators for the empire, as I understand it, and that's where we get all these exams from. To qualify one to enter into that system. The second was in ancient Rome. And the third one was in late Western Europe, where so many of the powers were imperial and developed universal compulsory state schooling systems, which they then spread out colonially all over the world or into the states that they also dominated, whether they were direct colonies or not. Now, these systems always apply themselves firstly to the domestic population, so that in Britain it was dealing with the way in which the Industrial Revolution had trashed the population, really, driven them in from the countryside where they did have a domestic life into an early industrialization chronic conditions, which education was sort of seen to be able to solve, to restore domestic life, to teach people all over again domestic skills, to discipline them to factory life, to mitigate social unrest, because there was a lot of social unrest in the 19th century over the effects of industrialization, to forge a common unity in a nation state of Britain, but then, of course, into empire as well. Now, there aren't the most powerful example, I think, of this development of universal compulsory state schooling is Prussia, because it's the Prussian model of universal compulsory state education, schooling, that all of the Western European countries adopted and spread out. They depended on the Prussian model. Now, the Prussian model began in the 18th century when Prussia wasn't an empire. It was just a little wannabe empire. It wanted to play with the big boys in Europe. And the major figure behind that was Frederick the Great, who, in order to achieve those aims to make Prussia a powerful state, militarized it. And producing universal state compulsory schooling was one of the major moves to militarizing the Prussian state. And to sort of understand what that means, it's not just a matter of that the whole population of males has got to be ready to down tools and march into battle, but it's also to understand a bit about what the 18th century military machine warfare was like, that it was human machines, blocks of men, highly drilled, firing muskets to order, all together and loading them to rigorous drill. So it's a very, very, very highly disciplined state that schooling was one of the means to. It took a while to implement. After, even though he put it technically in place, it wasn't fully implemented till well after his death. But that's the model that all European countries adopted for state compulsory schooling. Now, it's not the case today that every country is militaristic, and it's not the case today that every country wants to be an empire. But it is the case that every country uses universal compulsory state schooling for mostly for the economy, but also for domestic peace. So you sort of see nation building. It's still absolutely fundamental to the process. And this has nothing to do with education in those basic terms that I mentioned it already. So if we were to try and rebuild education and try and make it appropriate for today, we wouldn't be looking at the universal compulsory state schooling system. In fact, I think we'd have to dismantle it largely as it is if we were ever going to achieve it. But there were two things that we would principally have to do. And the first is to sort of get our heads out of schooling and look at the rest of society and spread the responsibility for the growing minds around the society. And, you know, and one major institution that always was considered, long before schooling, to be a major educational institution was the family. As time has gone on, that's drifted out of educational discourse more and more. In fact, you know, often when schooling professionals are talking about it, they see the family as a problem, not as an educational institution. But I think the workplace is probably the biggest educational institution. It's the one we spend most of our lives in. And it would make a huge difference to education across the board if that was an educational site appropriate to its purpose. We're a very, very long way from that. And I think one of the reasons that schooling is the way it is because work is the way it is. But another institution, just look at politics today and ask yourself how these institutions and the people in it are acting as educators might in a properly educational world. And the second feature is that education would have to be driven by and its decision-making judged according to respect. Which is very much what I see to be the answer to this problem. Respect would have to be spelled out in enough detail so that we could tell when a decision was in accord with respect and when it wasn't. It can't be just a sort of a buzzword. And I think that the aspect of respect first that comes at home most with education and practice is self-respect comes first, because we're dealing with individual learners and each one of them has to be respected as an intrinsically worthwhile human being. And it's their self-respect that is at stake there. And I kind of define as something like this, that I think that each of us has a duty to work and to respect, in order to respect ourselves, to work out for ourselves and try and implement a worthwhile way of life, a meaningful and purposeful life for ourselves. That's a huge amount required of education to enable that. And if we recognize that each of us has that duty, then it is that we must respect in each other. It's the fact that each of us must develop such a right. We have a duty to ourselves as human beings to develop such a life that we must respect in each other, and we must work together to create common conditions of learning to enable that, to facilitate that. So I think of that as being a huge global problem, actually. It's one that we share all over the globe now. It's not just a domestic, as it were, issue. It's everywhere. But I just sort of suggest to you that we're caught in a paradox between our past way of looking at education and this present requirement. The paradox goes something like this. If you and I stand eye to eye as equal adults, equally worthwhile human beings, I dare not tell you how to live. I dare not tell you how you should make your life worthwhile, what its purpose should be, what should make it meaningful for you. If I do that, you'll call me out. And if you do that to me, I'll call you out too. At the same time, I can't, it's not for me to tell you what you should learn. I'm not allowed to set your curriculum. I'm not allowed to decide that for you. You might, under some mutual consent, ask for my advice, but that depends very much on your consent. And if I overset the mark, you'll tell me. But when we turn to the young, we just seem to lose all sense of that. There we have these vulnerable young people who are in our care. We have them in a circumstance where they're under compulsion, and we decide what they're going to learn, what's worthwhile, and what sort of people they're going to become in ways we'd never dare do it to each other. And yet those people are going to stand up one day, eye to us, many of us, those of us who are still alive, except for the old ones like me, and be able to demand that they be respected for their own decisions about all that. We're caught in this weird paradox, which is between the past and the present. Now, one of the ways in which this, it's not just incidentally, it's not just that this is an ethical paradox for us. The very warrant for our belief that we've got the knowledge to do it is compromised by the way we grew up. Because we went to school, and in school, one of the things that we didn't learn was anything about education at all. Math, science, language, all sorts of things, but no education as a part of the curriculum. And not only that, we didn't study schools either. We didn't study their authority, and we didn't study the authority of the knowledge, and we didn't study critically the authority of the teacher. And we all know why. I mean, everybody will tell me that it would call in question the whole structure that we were in as compulsory schooling. And the sell for that will be something, well, they're too young, you know, they would be unwise and irrational, and they would make silly decisions, and they would challenge the authority of the whole institution. But we grew up that way, and here we are as adults deciding that we can make decisions for the young on the basis of our schooling knowledge. And our schooling knowledge was done on the basis of depending on them to make the decisions for us. We're caught in this loop. We're caught in a cycle. And our own ability to judge it. We don't have the educational background training. We haven't thought about the educational issues or the educational principles to be able to do this. So the consequence is, I mean, I know that this sort of sounds absurd, but just sort of think about that for a minute. We're not in a much better position to make these decisions for them than they are, than children are, because we've not equipped ourselves to do it. We don't even notice any longer that there's a difference between education and schooling. So I think that there is only one way in which we could do anything about this, and this is how we bring them up. And I think that they do have to inquire themselves out of their own lives and interests, because we want them to be passionate people, and they need to apply educational principles to this in order to be able to make those judgments wisely and to grow their interests so that they will become capable of managing the world that they go into. But we've got to put educational understanding at the center of education for the learner. We've got to create an environment in which they can grow up with increasingly mature educational judgment, not our judgment, their judgment. Because they've got to put their we've got to put their lives in their hands. They've got to become in charge of their minds. They've got to become in charge of their experience and what they make of it. And they've got to become masters of their own learning. And there's no other way that you can do that except developmentally.
Makes sense. Yeah, so great insight. I think you have covered, if you talk about the purpose of education, every dimension of it, that history of education, how it was imported by different countries, and what should be the ideal purpose of education. While we discuss all these things, we have started getting few questions. So I'll just put up a question which came from a parent. As a parent, I do not find any option other than school to start homeschooling, because when we talk about that, okay, we can do whatever we want to do and do homeschooling, I'm not sure how to go about it. Any tips, inputs to break the mental barrier? So practically what parents can do?
I know everybody's trapped in that dilemma. I mean, when I talk to people quite outside education, I mean, I worked in nursing homes for 6 years, and I talked to the staff there, and they all agreed that schooling wasn't educational, but they didn't know what to do about it. And I can only think that we all have to start in our own corner and try and understand education. I think one of the core things, that the first things I think that we probably need to do to understand education ourselves is to put to one side the idea that education is something we have to do to other people. the first thing we have to do is understand that education is about ourselves. I mean, I always found that when I was teaching about education in university, the students thought that education was something you do to people outside there, that it isn't about themselves. Now, the first thing that we've got to do is look at our own histories through schooling and in other ways, and try and understand the extent to which we are not in charge of our own minds. Try and understand what we would do if we tried to improve them. Try and learn how to make those educational judgments ourselves. Try and, I mean, I think that one of the reasons we don't look outside schooling is we don't do that enough. If I ask students what the most important thing in their lives that they ever learned, they never told me a story about schooling. It was always about their families and their home. That's where they learned the most important things in their lives. So if we firstly got to start to do that, to practice looking at ourselves in educational terms, trying to understand educational terms. It's hard to change a system unless people are aware of the way in which they lapse into schooling talk the minute that they talk about education. And we're not going to be able to bring about the political change or the change even in schools that's necessary until people start to get an educational awareness and start to realize that it isn't just about schools. It's another thing that will sort of happen. If you try it as an experiment, start a discussion with someone and say to them, education isn't just all about schools, you know. And they'll probably agree that it is about other institutions. And then just let the educational discussion roll a bit, and I'll bet money on it that within 5 minutes they'll be talking about schools again. You know, that they don't really appreciate that in their work life, they're constantly learning about who they are. They're constantly learning all sorts of things that are not good for them as well as things that are good for them. That's an educational environment too. The more that they come to understand that, the more that they'll be able to, I think, this is just my sense of it, to look at how they're bringing their children up and to protect them from it. Because I think that there are a lot of teachers out there who themselves know that schooling isn't educational and struggle with it. They want to be more humane. They want to be more respectful. They would be able to move, even within the rules, their schooling in an educational direction. But they've got to do it with more than just hunches and intuition. Do you know what I mean? Am I being clear about this?
Definitely we are getting, though when I talk to so many parents, I think again and again the question is about the combining the practical aspect with the philosophy aspect. So it's like having good health is an ideal thing and everybody wants to achieve it. Though on daily basis, once they get up in the morning, people usually also need that what they should do. And I understand that as an individual, we may say that, okay, it's an individual journey. Everybody is having individual body. But parents are actually struggling to find what they are supposed to do. And I think because they are not getting the concrete answer that what they are supposed to do, they end up following the same education system and going to school. It's a typical thing, I think. What do you think about it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very impressed by the alternative schools that are, you know, the democratic schools that are very learning centered, where children pursue their own interests. And I'm very impressed with homeschooling or unschooling, where the schooling is very heavily organized by the kids themselves with the help of the adult. And I think that's I think one of the most important things that you can do for young people growing up is not to be so concerned about what you have to teach them, but to what you can do to encourage them in their interests. And also by, I could say talking to them, but having conversations with them, listening to them, taking on board where they are and having sort of debates about them I'm an old guy, you see. I mean, I grew up in a household where you had dinner at the dinner table, and my parents, although they didn't really have a high school education, what they did was encourage discussions at the dinner table. And I think that was one of the most powerful things that ever happened. And in those discussions, they didn't pretend to have the answers. Do you know what I mean? It was they were discussions in
Open-ended questions.
We were all discussing. And I also had an opportunity with them and with relatives. People would come to visit, adults would come to visit. And I got to the stage where there was a toss-up whether I would go and play with other kids outside or whether I'd sit and listen to the adults. And it was partly because I wasn't there to be seen and not heard. My parents did allow me to talk, to say things, to suggest things, ask questions, tell a story. But it was according to I had to understand that it was their discussion and it was according to their rules. Do you know what I mean? It was respectful. It wasn't that I was just to be quiet and totally submissive, but it also was to be respectful of the adult discussion. And I seem to have spent an awful lot of my growing up with adults. And I think that was a very powerful thing. I mean, I think to be around enthusiastic adults and listen to their talk, not to their answers, not to their when they decide that they conclude that they're going to have something to teach you, but to listen to their conversation, to them changing their minds, to them disagreeing politely with each other is vital. And I think that also, I've often thought of it that if there's one thing that schools should achieve, it is to be able to achieve respectful conversations among children, among their peers, when they disagree with each other or are exploring some foreign idea. If they cannot bring young people up to talk with their peers in a constructive manner, then I'm not sure that any of the other educational stuff is worth it. And an awful lot of that you can do at home. Do you know what I mean? It's a kind of a foundation. And a lot of kids don't get that at school. They get a kind of a treatment of the adult authority at home that they get at school. And they're at a consequence. They're sort of at a sea about what to make of their own experience or how to change their mind or how to reason it through. I think that I've said before that I think that one of the most powerful processes that is actually in schooling is philosophy for children, where young children work as a team on a problem in discussion. And the adult's role is not to interfere with the opinions or to praise them even. It's to help them to get more skill in the discussion. And we can all learn that. I mean, that's what, if I was going to have something that was spread out in the community, I would have that. And if I was going to have a single process in the workplace that would improve the quality of the workplace and the ability of people to work together and to contribute their intelligence to the workplace, I would be running those same kinds of philosophical discussions with adults. But I wouldn't be doing it in the first instance about the work. I'd be doing it about life. You know, that's another thing that happened in the rest home with the staff members there. When I talked about this, I realized how crazy keen they were to get together in a conversation with equals, with other adults, and talk about issues of life, of their lives, serious
Makes
ones.
sense.
And if we did more of that, and we don't need to do it just in schools, but everywhere, then schools will respond. You know, I mean,
we have another question. Yeah.
Yep, surely.
Mr. Oliver, we have another question coming from one of the viewer there, from Alpha Single. If we choose unconventional methods, not typical school education, still it ends up in the educational convention system. Like, okay, it seems like any college degree, etc. What are your views? So it seems like whether we do some innovation at the school level, but at the higher education level, we again end up in joining some college, which is conventional. So what should be the way out?
Yes, Well, there are a number of things that I would sort of say about that. I don't sort of know how I would rebuild the universities themselves. I think that it's in my time, universities themselves have sort of deteriorated badly into vocational schools and profit-making corporations, if you like. I mean, when I was a young teacher, if there were any people in the country who spoke out for education, it was the vice chancellors of universities or the college presidents. And I understand that's similar in America. But you never hear them speak out for it today. They're CEOs, they're corporate executives. The second thing is that it wasn't until graduate school I had a remarkable experience at graduate school, both at master's and with my doctorate, where the classes were conducted extremely like those philosophy for children discussions that I mentioned, and it's there that I learnt most of my philosophy. I learnt it in discussions, and I learnt it from my other students as much as anything, because it carried on outside class. We had a fantastic time, walking together down the quad, having tea together and things like that. So the culture of universities has deteriorated somewhat. I mean, I've even read recently that in the Enlightenment, in the 18th century, universities were places where like-minded intellectuals actually got together in discussions about topics of mutual interest. I found university as a lecturer to be a very, very lonely place. I was on my own. The faculty didn't get together to discuss intellectually. If you ever got together with other faculty, it was when you went to a conference, which is a very strange sort of environment. But as far as growing up to contend with that is concerned, I'm impressed by the stories of homeschoolers and young people who have grown up through that environment, who have then gone to college, found ways to get into college, and how successful they were. My landlady here on the little farm that I live on went to a school just down the road, which was a very much a democratic school, and her husband said from what he gathered, she just played all day. But she, so it didn't harm her ability to do graduate work. But unfortunately, I think universities have deteriorated in terms of being environments where you go to get intense discussions about issues that matter to you in and out of class. And that, I'm sad about that. I mean, they're far too vocationally oriented now. Teacher training, as you see, when I went through, education was a subject in the arts faculty, and I was trained in a teacher's college, not with a degree, it was a certificate. Well, now the whole thing is done by a school of education, and they feel you can do the whole educational thing themselves, and I think that's just crazy.
No, that definitely answered, but I see a scope coming up from this discussion that when we only try to attach education with school and college, I think a lot of things can go as an individual, as a parent. What they can do and what we can do as a parent is to look through another set of activities which we can do, which we also call education. So in earlier discussion, when you talked about discussion happening over a dinner table and the activities which can be done. So I think we, as a parent, we need to broaden our space that beyond school and college, what can be done, which we consider as education, right?
Yeah, I think that I mean, schooling has failed us in so many ways that people when they finish their schooling breathe a sigh of relief. Thank God it's over, finished. I don't have to do this anymore. We talk about how education is supposed to be lifelong enthusiasm, lifelong learning. Develop a passion for learning. Well, show me it. Because you throw your hat in the air when you finish your degree, and so many of them are I never want to do that again. And they only do it because they have to. In adult life, we're going to have to go back and train again for another job. And I think I said to you, because if you look at a school, where are the adults? Schools are scattered throughout our communities and our suburbs and places like that. The only adults in them are the teachers. It's not as if adults are rushing to the local education centre to get together to learn something on their own. They don't want to. They don't have time to either. But I mean, we haven't developed a culture in which people really want to learn and seek each other to do it, because the quickest, fastest way to learn stuff is to be with other people, hear their talk. I mean, and to listen to people who know things you don't know. That's really quick. And if you want to read a book, it's a hard book, find someone who's read it. And talk to them a bit about it. Tell them to give you a synopsis of it and tell you a bit about it. It'll be a much easier book to read. But we don't have all that structure either for adults. It's just not there in the community, and we're unaware of how to do it ourselves, to go out and seek people. And I mean, I'm really
I can relate to that fact that the joy of learning and that curiosity is somehow missing in the way we are taught these days. And definitely, I interviewed so many people. So in my personal experience, I was in one of the city in India, and there I met these young tattoo makers, and I started interviewing them, and it came out that they were so enthusiastic in learning, so they left schools because they wanted to learn more, and they did not see that curiosity of knowing more and learning power is not getting fulfilled in the school. So it's a very interesting thing. People say that people drop out of school as if they are not seeking the education, but it's like that they were seeking more education. They want more curiosity to be served in the school, which they did not find, and that's how they left the school. And nowadays, whenever they are in some flux or something, facing some crisis, they get into some mode of solitude where they start thinking, start nurturing their learning and curiosity, and then come back to the work. So many possibilities that exist.
Yeah, I think
another question coming on.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you were about to say something, then I'll share the question. Yeah.
No, that's all right.
So we have this question. I believe our kids are losing social connects or values day by day, and maybe that's due to too many electronic gadgets around us. What's the way to avoid that?
Yeah, I know I've got one recipe to fix everything. I'm sorry about this. But if I go back to something like the philosophy for children or those kinds of discussions, there are two things that happen there. I mean, they're very, very social, and so they work as a model for respect themselves. That is, if you're going to run a philosophical discussion and it's going to be run by the group, then you've got to learn some basic rules of respect. That you don't laugh when somebody else comes up with what sounds like a silly idea, for example, because how often does it turn out that what somebody says is a silly idea is actually something you've never really thought seriously about? Often the laugh is on us. So that these discussion groups have a morality built into them of respect, and they're little models of democracy, and they're little models of social connection. So as they work better and better, and you can examine, for example, moral problems through them, like whether they're lying or trust or friendship or anything like that, the group becomes more trusting of each other and more are able to be more vulnerable with each other and more protective of each other, and it spills outside. I've heard of the effect on playgrounds and of disruptive behavior going down and things like this because these discussions are run continually. So I think that they're an ideal little model, and I think that they do have a chance of doing the things, the social connection and values, the fundamental values of respect are built into them, into the way that they're structured. And with respect to things like electronic gadgets around you, kids get really, really keen on this. I mean, I've heard of teachers who are constantly, the kids are coming up to them, can we have a discussion on this? Can we have a community of inquiry on that? If it's done properly, they get enthusiastic about it. More learners who are reluctant to speak start to speak. The kids who are looked on as school failures, usually in the system, are the ones who get most out of it because they suddenly discover that other people, their peers, respect their thoughts. And so they start to trust their own minds. So, I mean, I think that people, done properly, children will seek out these occasions where they can have these discussions with each other. And if the education system, less and less of schooling, more and more of this sort of thing, are encouraging these kinds of things, and there'll be more and more occasions for it. They'll get things out of their electronic gadgets. I don't think that we need to worry about that, but they'll get more and more out of each other, and they'll turn to each other more and more, and they'll ask questions of each other. And one of the things that is bad about the school structure too is that we're all by age cohorts, so that we don't have kids. Like if it was by interest cohorts, if you went to it because if you got into a group with other kids because you had the same interest, not because you were the same age, then you'll be with kids who know more than you do because they're a bit older, have been down that track a bit. So they'll be the ones that you ask the questions about, not necessarily teachers. You'll learn more from them. In fact, I once had a student who said to me he thought that he learned more from his brother, his siblings, than he did from his parents. And I've been thinking about that for years because I think it's true. I've learned more, or at least massively important things from my 3-year-old brother than I did from my parents, because there are things you can't ask your parents, and there are things your parents are not going to tell you. So breaking up these age bands that we're moving through is really important, and focusing it more on interest, because it's fine to use the electronic gadgets if it's about something that they're interested in, but if it's about something they're interested in, there'll be other people around them who are interested too. You want to pour petrol on that,
totally makes sense. So once we start serving their other needs, and I think it's the need for being on these gadgets may go down. And we have another question coming from which is it's in the regard of COVID. That question coming from Yogesh Huta, and there is another question also. So in current scenario, do our education boards need to redesign the annual curriculum in order to accommodate the gaps created because of lockdown? And in India, we do not give any recognition to homeschooling. COVID has given the chance to consider homeschooling similarly as the work from home are becoming the new normal in our corporate world. So I think revolve more around the lockdown, that it gives an opportunity, and also is there any reform required from the board side?
There are a number of things, just a whole lot of things I'd like to say about it. These are just from observation, my own observations, and trying to apply always the principles to them that I've been doing. Firstly, with respect to something like homeschooling, people have had different, as I follow them on Twitter and hear them talking, people have had all sorts of different experiences of homeschooling. Firstly, let me say that I think that if we did education in the way that I've been describing, the role of the teacher would be much less. There would be much, much, much less teaching. And so the role of the educator would be a lot easier. And I think that one of the dangers when we turn to homeschooling in an emergency like this is that we end up by trying to do schooling at home. And that's incredibly demanding. It turns out to be incredibly demanding on teachers, and it puts an enormous burden on parents. But I hear parents who have sort of stepped away from that a bit, and they sort of say, oh, look, my boy's more relaxed than he used to be, and he's following this interest and he's following that interest. And they are able to relax more, and they are able to enjoy their children more. Now, the problem goes back to what you were saying about the business of gaps. This is an artifact of the schooling system, the way that we've got it, that we've got to have all this testing, and we've got to go through lockstep year by year, according to a whole curriculum plan. And we end up with this idea that people are going to fall behind. Now, because we've got this incredible artificial structure, it's artificially created by us for a whole lot of reasons that aren't educational at all. There's kind of a problem there that shouldn't have to exist. If children came out of their schools for 6 months and did other things, pursued their interests, lived with their parents, lived around their parents, and did things together for 6 months, following their own interests, and then went back to school, they shouldn't have to be harmed. They're only harmed by that sense that, oh, we're now a year behind. When, as I keep saying to people, if at 25, when you're in the workplace, is the person who's 28 or 30, are they that much farther ahead of you? Is the 21-year-old working beside you behind you? Those differences fall away when we get out of the schooling system and into the real world. I mean, you could take a year off and come to New Zealand and work on a farm, and you've taken a gap year. Is the person working beside you lost something because they did that? You might not even know they did it. But they probably benefited immeasurably in terms of their ability to cope with their lives and their originality and their creativity and their independence because they did all that. So we've created a rod for our backs by this intense grading system, this ladder that has to be climbed, and that we're going to be, you know, I mean, if everybody missed a year of schooling and then we just restarted the ladder, it won't have ruined their lives. It won't have harmed their lives. I can't see how it can. You know, look at how we operate in the workforce. Have a gap year. Do something with it. You use it to grow.
Okay, so,
but I can't give you. Yeah. Oh, sorry, I can't give you an answer to how to make the school board resolve the problem that it's created for itself here, unless it can find some way to relax those assumptions that it's got about a way it has to operate.
Definitely. And in between, I would like to share with the viewers right now that there is a book by Mr. Graham Oliver on education as if our life depends on it, and it is available on his website, whatiseducationhq.com/articles/educationasf. So whole lot of book is shared as a set of articles, and you can definitely go through those articles. I myself went through a couple of articles and found them really useful to understand, because education per se, it's a long thing, it's a long discussion which cannot be covered completely in a short period of time. Having said that, I think today we have covered many aspects. We have another question coming from Kalpan Parikh. What do you do to make kids more focused and make them enjoy what they are learning?
Well, the problem is that we've made the decision about what they have to learn, and then we've got to get them engaged, which doesn't work very well. I mean, it never has worked very well, and it flows through into the workforce. I mean, I think there are some studies, Fortune 500 or Forbes or something like that, on the huge level of disengagement in the workplace in the United States. I mean, the same issue flows all the way through. And if I can give you an anecdote. A parent came to me because her child was in terrible trouble at school, and she wanted me to talk to him. And after some discussion, I couldn't see what talking to me would do anything, because I can't change the school. Nobody at school's going to listen to me. But I eventually agreed to listen to him. And he came to me, and we talked about it. And he said, look, because he was constantly getting into trouble. He was in so much trouble that when there was recess, he had to stand by the teacher in recess who was on duty. He had to stand at her shoulder all the way through recess because he was constantly getting into trouble. And he said, I don't want to get into trouble. I just can't help myself. You know, I get so frustrated, so fed up, I just explode. And I said, what do you really like? What do you really like doing? What are you really interested in? And he said, I really, really love going hunting and fishing with my uncle. And I sat back and I thought about that for a second, and I thought, what on earth couldn't grow out of that? You know, the mathematics from ballistics, all the environmental issues about fish and their breeding and things like that, all the geography, the geology, the climatology, name it, the literature, the poetry, the history, the politics, it's all there. But you don't ram it down them. You don't sort of say, here, this will help you fishing. You start with their fishing and hunting and spark their interest and pull it outward and broaden it. Because we're constantly faced with these kids who don't want to learn. I mean, they are making the educational decisions. We think we are by deciding what they should learn, but they're the ones who are deciding, and they're deciding with their attention and with their focus. They'd rather be focused on other things. But what we've got to do is turn those other things into the education, the heart of the educational, the inspiration for it. But if we treat them always en masse, as a class, and they have to be taught all together, and they all have to be examined in the same way for the same sort of performance outcomes, we're defeating ourselves, constantly defeating ourselves.
Definitely. I think that's a very, very key message, I would say, because I myself have seen that when I worked with people and working on their learning, that how they can learn better. And actually, I do a masterclass on learning mastery, and where I've seen that when we are reading or studying a subject which we don't like, it appears like an uphill. So you have to put an effort to go there and above it.
Yeah.
And when we are doing something which we are interested in, it's like going downhill. So naturally, so many things happen which we are not aware of. So problems like how to focus, how to motivate ourselves to work, all those things are not there when we are going that downhill journey.
It creates enormous bad habits too. I mean, we resist all sorts of other things. If I can tell another quick story, there was a 9-year-old girl who was a very poor reader in my class at one stage, but she was passionate about horses. So instead of teaching her reading, I didn't teach her any reading for months. I just bombarded her with horse books. We were able to get them from the library. And she went from one of the poorest readers to one of the best in a matter of months, just because she was just so passionate about horses, and there were all these horse books that she could read. And she read, devoured. And how laboriously we try to teach reading. I mean, yeah.
Yes. So while we are discussing this thing, a question came to my mind, and out of curiosity, it may sound as a personal question, that how that interest for education started in your life. Was it from the beginning that you wanted to make a change in the education, or at what point of time in your life that this thought triggered in you that I have to talk about education and schooling?
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. I didn't become a teacher because I thought being a teacher was going to be a great thing. I was mad keen on sailing little sailing dinghies at the time, and I needed to change careers. I knew that what I was in wasn't really any good, and my brother did too. And we looked at teaching and we thought, well, look, if you have a classroom of your own, at least you don't have someone standing over you. That was rule number one. And the second one was, I can go sailing after school and all those school holidays. Now, that's absolute rubbish because it's not like that. It's a very hard, busy job. But I just sort of got into it because once you get into your job, you've got to fake it. You've got to believe in this thing. You've got to make it matter to you because you're going to spend your life doing it. And that's why I kept studying. And when I got up to around the master's level, I started to run into these courses, and I had developed this problem about what the purpose of education was. And I ran into these courses where they were being taught and the people around me were so interesting. And I spent time with them. And I started to get passionate about it then. The problems became personal. But it was way late. It was way when I was just so lucky in the people I got in amongst. At university, and I have to say, I contacted them years later because my career didn't work out like my graduate work did, but I contacted the philosopher I'd studied with at masters years later and thanked him for those years, and he said, "Yeah, I thought those years would last forever because they were unique little years with a unique little bunch of students." And then I wrote to the person who was our mentor at the University of Illinois and thanked him for the same experience that I'd run into there. And when he wrote back to me, he said, yeah, I thought it was going to last forever, but it only lasted for about 3 or 4 years. So, I mean, so much luck in that I managed to get, managed to kindle a passion that's kept me going. It's been the core of my life.
And it may sound, it's a very interesting journey, and it may sound as an example itself, that it need not be that we are always aware about our passion. It's like following one step further, and then we may find our true passion out of it.
Yeah, and school can kill people's passion. I mean, it's killed people's desire. I mean, I saw someone on Twitter saying, if you want to kill someone's passion, set them a book to read on it, and then require them to write a report or answer questions on it, or something like that. If you want to really kill them.
I totally agree.
Yeah. I mean, I think that part of that educational growth that I was sort of saying, look, we need to teach children how to make educational judgments. So, one of the principles is growth for the sake of further growth. So you want kids growing up to sort of say, well, I'm passionate about this, but how much more is there to it? What would happen if I studied the history? What difference would that make to my understanding of it, to my passion? I wonder what else there is like this that I could, go and explore. You want them to be explorers.
Yes.
And to know that
totally
their growth is the way to do the exploring, not just down the same tube, but outward. And
makes a lot of
both
sense.
Outward and in depth, I guess, if you want to say. Both of those as principles. Because that's how we'd design it if we were going to do it to them.
Yes. And as we can see that Mr. Oliver mentioned about his Twitter handle. So in the bottom, there is a running ways to connect with Mr. R. Graham Oliver, because a lot of articles has been written, and he's also having his personal business website, rgrahamoliver.com, LinkedIn profile, and a Twitter profile. He's very active on Twitter because I have been following him, and that's how I connected with him, because seeing his inspiring and very revolutionary thoughts on education. So you can follow him on Twitter. Any last message for our audience, because we are already running out of the time?
I know you're
from you. Any last message, key message that
I would just
can adopt?
I would just encourage you to go down this line that I'm trying to recommend, because one of the things about it, if anything else, is that if you do education this way, say you do as a parent, it's massively educational for yourself. If you're thinking about it this way for your children, but also thinking about it for your own sake, it's an exciting journey, because you become in charge with and charged by the whole idea of what is it to live a worthwhile life, a purposeful, meaningful life. How do I go and figure that out? What do I need to explore to do that? How do I talk to other people about that? And it becomes just such a benefit, because you learn so much from other people in the process. It's enormous. That's why the philosophy of children discussions among kids are stunning to listen to. I mean, if there's a video on YouTube called Socrates for 6-year-olds, and it's an old one from about the 1970s, but it shows you the process. Socrates for 6-year-olds, really good. But thank you. I mean, I'm so appreciative of the opportunity to speak like this, because I'm.
Yeah, and I think the viewers are getting further interested. I got another question, and this is the last question. I don't want to miss that part. Quickly, we'll show you to get your quick view on it. From Alpa Single, education trend is changing now. School focus more on extracurricular activities and don't focus on basic education needs of students. What are your thoughts on this?
I think this is all a good step in the right direction, and a lot of teachers also are focusing on or trying to do things like self-directed learning. I hear of them all the time, and they want to put the learner first. There are an awful lot of people out there. It's struggling though, because I mean they have to struggle against those like school board requirements and things. It's a very difficult thing to be a teacher who wants to be an educator, but if we were going to get a proper education system, I don't think we would burn the schools down and start again from scratch. We would move them towards more and more educational directions. And there are these trends there that are to be fueled. It's just that I wouldn't want anyone to mistake them for education, because they're always constrained by those concerns about curriculum setting and measurement and testing and examination that constantly subvert everybody's best intentions. I don't envy teachers. I really, I know there are so many out there who are trying so hard. Mental health strains, because of what they're trying to do. I mean, I appreciate that.
And we have with that, I think we have come to the end, and we have got a thanks message from one of the viewer, Chavi Singhal. I'm really thankful to Mr. Oliver for sharing such great information and great eye opener for me as a parent. So from all of us, thank you, Mr. Oliver, for sharing your precious time and these insights. As these are live session and things will be recorded. Yeah. Yes.
And don't hesitate to contact me if you want to talk about these things. Thank you very much.
And the details of...
It's been such a privilege to do this.
Yes. Thanks again. And for the benefit of others' information, we are having a program tomorrow with this information, Real Education of Top Leaders. And you can find the further details on the realeducation.com/events. Thanks again for watching, and thanks to Mr. Oliver again for sharing his precious time with us. And with that, for your further queries, you can always write in the comment, and we'll try to answer all the queries of yours, even in the future too, on these videos. Thanks again. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.